everybody's going on. We've got 10 scheduled for the year. They'll run from, the only 2 months we will not do them this year will be November and December. Next month, we have Mr. Don Hinton, who a lot of you know, will be speaking. In April, T.C. Bloxham will be speaking. In May, Richard Knowles will be speaking. And we've got a lot of other ones lined up. We're just trying to figure out what months to put them in and kind of coordinate with people's vacations and such. But I want to thank Charlie and Patty for letting us use this room every month. It's a big help to us. And I also want to thank Ms. Martin for the refreshments and thank Argent Financial and Ty Pendergrass for sponsoring our refreshments. Thank all of my board members that come and help me set up the room every month. And want to remind you too, if you did not sign up for the door prize, please do so. That's how we get our database for the mail out. So if you want to receive information from us, be sure to sign up for the door prize. I also have a Black History Month official print that we have framed. It's $100 value, and we'll be drawing for that later on tonight. And that's a $5 raffle. So if you'd like to get one of those, we'll remind you again after the end of the program, and you'll have time to purchase one of those. I also want to remind you too that after the program tonight, the museum will be open for 1 hour. The museum is right around the corner, so we urge you, if you haven't been to the museum, please go. It's been a while since you've been to the museum. You still want to go. We make changes every day, and Larry Milford has done a wonderful job. He just is full of ideas and just doesn't, there's not enough hours in the day for Larry to do all the things that he wants to do. So also, I think, keep Larry in your prayers too. He's got to have a little minor surgery this week on his ticker. They got to get him back in there. So we've been trying to keep him kind of stressed out, but I think it stresses Larry out more to not do stuff than it does. Because I've been telling him all week, Larry, you don't have to do that. Larry, you don't have to do that. But I think that stresses him out. So I'm just not going to tell him anything. So if he wants to do it, he can. But there again, I want to thank all of you. And we're going to have Thad Andrews, our association president, come up. And he's got some words of wisdom, I'm sure, for us. And due to a technical difficulty tonight, we're not going to have the PowerPoint presentation, which Dr. Phillips is just going to wing it. So y'all kind of bear with us on that.
I too would like to thank all of you for coming, and hope you will all come back to these monthly events and also go down and see the museum. We've made a lot of progress, and we're going to keep on making a whole lot more. And with the support of all the many people in the Minden West Parish area that have been so good to us in that way. And the nights of museums have worked very well. We didn't know what we were doing when we first started, but it really worked well. They brought in a lot more money, but they've also brought a lot of volunteers, and then they brought just a lot of interest in the museum. We have definitely created more interest in the history of this area. I think John Agan's the one that really started us off having a real interest. And as I said in one thing, that before we had no history, now it looks like we're the historical capital of the country. but anyway, before we go on to our speaker this evening, I'd like for Julie Vogel to come up, and she's promised some money. Julie is president of Cultural Crossroads, and they have done a wonderful job with their own projects there, and have created a lot more interest of art in the community. And we feel that our cooperation with them has been very fruitful. Julie?
We have been Cultural Crossroads and long-time supporters of Georgia Museum. We've been there from the very beginning, and we're very happy to give them again this year another $5,000 check. Cultural Crossroads. because she was sick. But thank you all so much, and we wish you all the best of luck. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. As for our speaker, well, let's go back a little ways on this. The Dolce Museum has long recognized when we first started getting exhibits that we really didn't have any exhibits that were truly recognizing the activities, the efforts, the importance of the black community to Webster Parish. And we started off, we tried various ways to get information there, and we did make some progress. But then we found out that James Smith, who was really interested in the history of the area, was willing to work with us, and Dr. Roy Phillips arrived on the scene there, and Dr. Phillips, as you'll know, I'll find out more, has also a historian there, and so they're both working for the museum now, for free mainly. But nevertheless, they are working for the museum to develop a story of the black history of Webster Parish, and when they've gotten along the way, well then they will work with our artist, designer, Larry Milford, in helping him to depict black history. And we've gotten a grant from about $2,500 from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for that work, but I assure you, we're going to spend a lot more than that on those particular exhibits, and it's going to be done well. Larry doesn't know how to do things not well, and it will be done well, and we were going, and in the next few months, I think we'll really have something for you to see. We hope that all of you that haven't been before will go down to the museum and see what we have already done, and the quality of the work there, because it is something we're really proud of. As our speaker this evening, we have a man who grew up in, well, started his life, he didn't grow up, started his life out on the Bellevue Road in the Growing Valley community area. They had a two-room school there, the Growing Valley Elementary School. I think it was a Rosenwald school back in the 1930s. And Dr. Phillips had to walk 5 miles each way to get to that school. And he got there and back. And what I'm reading in this book has strict orders from his parents there. Don't mess up on the way you get there. But after, then his father got a job at the International Paper Company up in Spring Hill, and he went to school there. Actually, the Colored Missionary Baptist Church had a school. He went to school there. Then he went out to California, and then ended up for quite a long time in Michigan, Muskegon Heights. That's where you
That's right, Muskegon Heights, Michigan.
There, and he graduated from high school there. He went on to get an undergraduate degree at Eastern Michigan University, and then another master's at Wayne State, and then finally he received his doctorate from the University of Michigan. Since that time, he's been the chief executive, president, vice president of 5 different community colleges, one in Detroit, Seattle, Omaha, Miami, and Coral Gables, Florida. And so he's had a very busy life. His wife of 52 years, Vera, 51 years. Is here with us tonight. We're certainly happy to have her here, and has a large family too, and so he's been very busy. He's going to tell us about his work in far as his research work going back to Africa. And I'm proud that he has done that. I'm really more proud of all that he has done in life. Now, present Phillips.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for that very fine introduction. I didn't need all of the words. I'm not looking for a job. Got enough job now. First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight on this bad weather. We apologize for the inconvenience of not being able to deal with the technology. Always remember Murphy's Law. Essentially, I want to thank Phil Demeline. I want to thank John, Professor John Hagan, for assisting me. And of course, Shelley's always there to help. And of course, James Smith is my assistant over here, who is helping me to pull a lot of this voluminous information, because I didn't realize the amount of work involved in this project. It's a tremendous amount of work, setting up interviews and collecting information personally. What I'd like to do this afternoon briefly with you is to kind of give you kind of an overview of a book that I've written. And by the way, I just got this copy today. The publishers messed up my book. And you have to always get back to these guys, and they just shipped me a book today, so I don't have a volume of books for people who might want to buy, but I do have a sheet where you can put your name down if you want to purchase a book, and we can see that you get it. This book is called Exodus from the Door of No Return, Journey of an American Family. Now, the first edition of this book came out in 2006. And I made a revision of it when I came back to Western Parish. I began to discover other information from slave owners in the Bossier Parish area. And since that time, I've met with some of those descendants of the owners of these slave plantations here in the area, and collected a lot of information from them. So the last chapter in here is really on my return and what new information I've collected. What I like to do this afternoon basically is to run through about 8 areas briefly, since I don't have a slide presentation, and kind of give you some idea of how we put this together. My motivation for this book came from Alex Haley. In 1968, I was working on my PhD from the University of Michigan, and the graduate students invited Alex there to talk about his research. At that time, he was in the process of putting all of his research together. So I sat up with Alex almost all of the night, because he was such an exciting speaker, and he just kept us on edge about what he was doing, and I was very curious about it. And I asked him a question. I said, Alex, how would you go about doing this kind of work? So Alex says, simply, go back and talk to the old folks in your family. So I came back here and started collecting information from older folks. My grandmother, who lived to be 102, had a lot of history in her head. And by the way, those of you who want to write, you need to talk to old folks before they leave this earth, because they have a tremendous amount of history in their head that they can share with you. So I went back and started talking to my grandmother. Her name was Caroline Green, and I'm living on her land. And that's the reason I came back, because of land here. And I didn't want to see the land disappear, so my wife and I decided, after I retired, to come back into Grand Valley, where I grew up, and build a house. So I live out in the rural area. I talked to my grandmother, and my grandmother told me that she had talked to her grandfather. And her grandfather had told her that he was shipped into this area as a slave. And he was sold to a man by the name of McDade. Now that kept in my ear for a long time. I wondered, who is McDade? Who is this person called McDade? And then I started investigating on this man's name. And I started to call the library in Bossier City, and basically they gave me information on this Mayberry family. There were 5 brothers who came to this Bossier parish, and they were slave owners. And I'll talk a little bit about them later on. So this is what motivated me to write this book. Around 2002, I was invited to go to Ghana, West Africa, to work with a chief there by the name of Nana Gippy. Nana Gippy is the senior divisional chief in Ghana, in a little town there called Cape Coast, which is located a few miles, 100 miles or so from Accra, the capital of Ghana. Some of you who may want to know, Ghana is here on this map. It's part of West Africa. And that's why most of, in fact, the majority of slaves who came to the United States, America, and Caribbean Islands came from this coast. We'll get into the details on that later on. So basically, they invited me to come there to help them to build community colleges. And if you know anything about African countries, they are trying to, they have a university system because most of the people who live on the West Coast, especially in Ghana, have gotten most of their educational start from the British system. So they have a British type of education, and most of it is higher education. They don't have too much in the area of technical education. So they were interested in helping to develop community colleges there in that town, in Accra, and also in the Cape Coast. So I went there, and I took with me my assistant. At the time, I was president at Miami-Dade Community College at Homestead. Well, actually not in Homestead. I was president first at the North Campus in North Dade, later on to the district office, and later on in the Homestead, where I founded the campus, Homestead, Florida, where the Homestead Air Force Base is located. So basically, I went there, I flew there, and met with the chief, and also met with the Minister of Basic Education for Girls, and also met with the Chief Executive Officer of their higher education system in order to get information about that. And while I was there, I was curious, and I talked to Alex, and I wanted to find out something about slavery and something about how people came from that country. Now, the chiefs in these countries have quite a bit of information in their heads, and they can tell you what happened because they feel sorry and feel regretful of what happened because they had a lot to do with how we got here. Then I began to do other kinds of research because I wanted to find out exactly where in West Africa my ancestors came. At the time, I thought they came from Ghana, West Africa. And the chief said, "You look like you're one of us." I said, "Maybe you're part of this group." I said, "Well, maybe I'm not." So I began, when I came back, I did a DNA analysis. And what I did, there's a project called the African Ancestry Project in Washington, D.C., where one can send part of his cheek cells, and they can examine those cheek cells, and they can tell you exactly where and what group of people in Africa you came from. So that's what I did in order to get more detail on my ancestry. Of course, as you know, and by the way, I'm not a historian, I'm really a biologist by trade. That's my field of biology, undergraduate as well as graduate school. And I do this as a hobby. I write and research as a hobby. This is my hobby. I'm not a historian. And I write a lot. So essentially, I took this test, and this test, the test will tell you two things. The test will tell you basically what your maternal history is. And any of you can do that because the Human Genome Project is a worldwide project, and you can get this data. They can tell you exactly where you came from and what group of people and exactly what country you came from. So basically, the DNA, as you know, is located, deoxyribonucleic acid is located in the nucleus of the cell, and that contains all of your biological genetic history. Now, in the cell, there's the chromosomes, course, some of you who know something about biology know that Lieberberg, Crick, and others uncovered that back in the 60s, the DNA molecule. And in that cell, you have the Y chromosome of the male, and that Y chromosome can tell you about your paternal history. Of course, your maternal history is taken from the mitochondria, which is part of the cytoplasm of the cell. And the mitochondria examination of that DNA material, or that genetic material, can tell you exactly where your maternal history is. So I took that test and I sent it back to Washington, D.C., and that test told me that my maternal folks came from this little small country called Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, again, is in West Africa, on the west coast where most of the slaves came from. And it also told me that I came from a group of people called the Minden, M-E-N-D-E, the Minden people. And the Minden people constitute about 1/3 of the population of that country. And if any of you know about the Amistad was a ship, a slave ship, that left to bring slaves from that country to Cuba. And the slaves created a mutiny and they killed the captain. And they took the boat over. And some of you have seen the movie of the Amistad. And of course, John Adams, the great president, intervened for them to help them to free themselves. Well, these people were the Minden. They were Minden people who came to this boat. So that's where my maternal people came. And probably most of you in here, because I'm related to a lot of people here. A lot of your parents came from the same area. And then basically, I was quite surprised when they told me where my father's folks came from. My father's folks came from the Central African Republic, right here. And I said, what? The middle, kind of right by the Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Cameroon, and Chad. This is where he came from, according to his DNA analysis. And they came from a group of people called the Mabuti people. Now I'll get into these people later on because most of the slaves who came here came from the area from Angola all the way over to Mali. That's where most of them came from. This country was shipped into the Caribbean and into the Americas. They came from those countries, and I'll get into details on it in a minute. How do you go about collecting all of the information? Now, then I began to look at the ancestry of what Mama Caroline told me, that Alfred Gooding, who is the person that we traced back, she said he came from the state of Virginia. And he was brought into he was shipped into, she told me he was shipped into this area. Now, I have not found out yet what she meant by ship, but I have put in my book a legend about where he was shipped. And my assumption was that he came from Virginia, and he may have been shipped from Portsmouth, Virginia, the coastal line, through Carolina, through Charleston, Carolina, into New Orleans. New Orleans was a slave port. And from New Orleans up the Red River into Bossier. Because if you know anything about the McDade, they came in here, well, first the McDade, I traced the McDade family, and I found that they came from Scotland. They were driven from Scotland by Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell. They remember the Davis group. Like a lot of people were evicted from Europe, like blacks were evicted from Africa. And they came here, and most of them settled in Virginia. They settled in South Carolina, but they came here from Montgomery County, Alabama. And they came into Georgia, and later on, somewhere around when the state opened in 1812, they began to come into this area, 5 brothers, into Bossier Parish. Now, Bossier Parish, if you know anything about Bossier Parish, it was heavily slaved. The plantations were located, Horton, Fillmore, McDade, Taylortown, all that was plantation country. A lot of cotton in that area. So that's where his plantations were. And by the way, I've talked to people whose ancestors have lived on that plantation and gotten the story about how they ran it. So I have a lot of history about how they ran these plantations. But anyway, basically, Alfred Gooding, that was his name, he spelled his name, well, in the census record, and by the way, I went to the census record, and you can go to the census by going to the computer, and if you know the name of that person, and if you know what parish they came from, or what, you can trace it. And that's what I did. I went to the archives in Washington, D.C., and started to look at this Alfred Gooding, and I traced him to Western Parish, and I found out his history. So part of what I'm putting in the museum is his history and all his family. And I met the Goodings in this town. Betty Gooding, Icy Mae Gooding. Betty Gooding is a teacher. Many of you know Betty Gooding is a teacher. And she belonged to your church, right? Okay, very good. Anyway, I came out of that group, the Gooding group. Now, I've traced also other families that came into this area, and I've traced another family called the Brooks family. I traced them. I found out the Brookses were originated from Maryland. Maryland and Virginia is where that maternal side came. And somehow, after 1812, they probably, when the state of Louisiana began to, especially in the northwestern section of the West, because people began to move and migrate, white families, from the Middle Tennessee area, from Georgia, into this northwestern part of Louisiana, and settled here as plantation owners. And they brought their slaves with them into this area. So essentially, in the end, Alfred Gooding was found, and I have not gone into the slave records yet. It's hard to find those slave records. They've been destroyed probably. But that's where he was on the McDade plantation. Now, another family, which is a great-great-grandparent, actually, because he married into what's called the Brooks family. And the Brookses came in here from Maryland. And I would imagine, and I assume, for some reason, they came in here with the Germans. Because I noticed where, in Maryland, along the one area, there's a German town there. And when the Germans came into Minden, some of them probably had slaves. Maybe they came with them. That's an assumption that I'm making. But anyway, I began to search these records, obituary records, church records, because I am also collecting church history. And I've collected most of the church history in this town, and also throughout the parish, and found out when they were established during the Reconstruction. And some were established by whites and blacks during the period before slavery. And I have a lot of that done. In fact, I'm finishing that chapter at this point. But anyway, that's kind of what I did. Now, when you view black history, you must view it within the context of a larger human history. And what I want to do briefly now is kind of tell you something about the history of West Africa. West Africa had three major empires during the medieval period in Europe. During the period in which Europe was in decline, this area of Africa, West Africa, had three great empires that I just want to briefly summarize with you. That was Ghana, this place here, Ghana. They call it at that time the Western Sudan. Ghana constituted probably this whole area here, this empire. Now, if you read the history of Ghana, Ghana started somewhere around 600 AD. That's when that empire started. And that was a ruler there by the name of Tenkaminen, who ruled Ghana during the middle of the 11th century. And he had an army of about 200,000 men. And one of the things that was on the west coast about it is gold. They call it the Gold Coast. And the word was from one historian called al-Bakri, who was an Arab historian, wrote a lot of the history of this area. And he said that he owned a gold nugget that was big enough for a horse to mount. And this is the thing that attracted Europeans into this area. Because this area was a supply of gold to North Africa and to Europe. And of course, as you know, Europe at this time, Spain was the first church that emerged from the Middle Ages. And Spain and Portugal were the first countries that were explorers and navigators. So the Portuguese were the first groups that came into West Africa, primarily to trade gold and spices. And while they were there, they built these forts. And I went to one of the forts at Cape Coast, where, and I'm going to talk about later on, where they kept the slaves after they captured them. The Ghana Empire fell to another group of people called the Mali Empire. And the Mali Empire was ruled by a group of people called the Mandingo or the Mandinka people. The Mandingo. The Mandingo was a group of people. Now, we don't call people tribes in Africa, just like you don't call people in Europe tribes. You call them people, ethnic groups. And there are many ethnic groups who speak, and I will talk about the languages of these groups in a minute. The Mali Empire had two major rulers, and I'm going to talk about two of them. One was called Santiago Kita, but the most famous one was called Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa is known for his pilgrimage to Mecca. In 1324, he took a total of about, according to my figures here, 60,000 people by camel and by overland travel to Mecca for a pilgrimage, because most of the people in this area, a lot of them were Muslims. You might note that when Muhammad took over, he spread his armies across North Africa, and a lot of people in West Africa became Muslims. So a lot of the slaves who came here were Muslims. They were Muslims in their faith, but when they came here, they were not allowed to practice that religious faith. Anyway, the empire Mali fell to another empire during the 15th century. Mali declined, and another empire rose called the Empire of Songhay, the Songhay Empire. And the great ruler there was called Askia Muhammad. Askia Muhammad was a great ruler. And Askia Muhammad had his capital along the Niger River. And the Niger, of course, is a long river in the area there. And one of the things that he built there were major cities. And one of the major cities there was Timbuktu. Many of you heard of Timbuktu. And they had major universities there. One university called the University of Sankore, where scholars came from as far as Europe there to study. Those empires fell around the time of the discovery of America. And Africa, West Africa, became an area of small villages and petty kings and petty rulers. It fell into decline. And basically, I'm going to just talk a little bit, summarize a little bit about the African people and what they brought into this country. The African people are highly religious people. They believed in a deity, they believed they had a pantheon of God, as most people in the world during that time had. Basically, the African people were heavy into music. Music was an everyday thing in Africa. That's why black people are probably very musical in nature. The things that Africans brought to this country was a polyrhythmic percussive technique and the call and response pattern, leader and chorus alternating. When we hear black people sing, the leader starts out, followed by the chorus. That's African in nature. That was the African way they brought this kind of music and technique, and the jazz, the blues, religious stuff that started in churches and traveled into other parts of the United States. I'm going to talk now basically about slavery. Because slavery had been a part of most civilizations. But there was a certain kind of slavery in West Africa, and I want to talk about the slavery in West Africa. By definition, of course, you know a slave is a commodity owned by someone else. And there were 6 ways in which a person would become a slave in West Africa. The first way a person becomes a slave is that if he committed a crime. If a person committed a crime in Africa, and he violated the laws of society, he was generally sold to work his slavery out, work his criminal activity out. Second point is one could lose his kinship. If one lost his kinship, could trace his bloodline, he became a slave. That's the second way. The third way, and most prevalent way, was ethnic conflicts. The breakdown of the three empires led people to conflict, with wars like they had wars in Europe and all over the world, wars. And oftentimes the people who were captured were sold as whole communities, as slaves. And the fourth one was some vassal state, like a vassal state, oftentimes gave that tribute in the form of slaves. And the fifth way is through somebody owes you a debt. Like a lot of European people came here on a debt and they became indentured slaves. Like a lot who came here to America. So if you owed a debt and somebody couldn't pay it, you became a slave. The sixth ones, some people willingly gave themselves up when there was a famine or something that came along, couldn't take care of themselves, became slaves. Now when the European people came into Africa, this is the kind of slavery they found. They found the slavery here. But slavery took on a different character with the European people. And I want to talk summarize a little bit about that. I said the first people who come into West Africa were the Portuguese. They came, the Prince Hitler and Navigator, Vasco da Gama, all those came down that coast. They came down that coast because they were looking for a shorter way to get to India in the Far East. So they came down the African coast. And when they came down the African coast, they came in contact with the people in those regions. And they came in contact with that slavery. But the first trading they did was for gold and spices. And later on, they began to buy slaves. And that's how slavery started with the European people. Now the concept of slavery began to change because the Portuguese had outposts in the Canary Islands. They also had outposts in the New World. And the Spanish, later on, the Spanish actually joined them in the New World. In the Caribbean area, Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, those were all slave places where they brought the slaves first before they entered into America. Now the first slaves came to America around 1690 into Jamestown, Virginia. We know the history of that area. But anyway, the Portuguese came and later on followed by French, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, the Brandenburg traders, and all those others came and began to trade. Anyway, the first group of slaves that were not black slaves, the Portuguese first began to pull in the Berbers. The Berbers who live in the desert. They are the white people who live in the desert. The Berbers, called gauchos. They were the first people. Then next, as they went into the island, they began to try to enslave the Indians, the Crab Indians, the Tanos, and the Arawak Indians. But what happened was, the Indian was susceptible to European diseases, and it killed out millions of them. Millions of the Indians were killed out, not only there in the Caribbean, but also when the Spaniards came to Mexico, and killed out by European diseases. Now, apparently black people had become immune to these diseases. Now, the great thing that happened is that sugar, after they went into the island, sugar became the main product, placed in gold. So as other groups began to come in, they began to bring slaves into the Caribbean islands on the large sugar plantations. Now, one of the things that spurred slavery, there were 4 factors according to Martin Bernard, who was a historian at Cornell University. Now here's what he said. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V put out a bull, bull non diversa, a papal decree, whatever the Pope said went. Remember, the Pope was over Spain and Portugal. And the Pope said, it is decreed that you can take anybody who is an infidel and a pagan. So that gave favor to Portugal and Spain to go along the west coast and begin to trade and make black slaves. Slaves already there. Start buying them and start bringing them in boats to the island and eventually to America. So religion had a lot to do with slavery. And in fact, as Bernard points out, it was a rise of Christianity that really promoted slavery. And I'm going to talk about 4 factors here. First of all, the rise of Christianity. Now, as you know, when Christianity, some of you ministers understand, when first started out, there were a lot of schisms in the Roman Empire. There were a lot of religions in the Roman Empire. Christianity had to fight its place to get to the top. But Constantine, remember, he gave blessings. He gave blessings to form the church. First church is his own system, the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church took an edge with the countries where they were, because the Pope had declared it. Now, as the Protestants came into being, the Protestants, who were mainly European people, the Germanic groups and the French and the English groups, they got involved. But they also began to form a protest about becoming part of this religious group. But there were a lot of schisms in the first church. A lot of schisms. They couldn't quite agree on things. But one of the things, the Teutonic people, the people who spoke the Teutonic languages, began to adopt Greek as the birth child of their languages. Therefore, the first translation of the Bible translated from Hebrew into what? Greek. Greek, not Latin. Latin was kind of, the Vulgate Bible was not quite a high Bible at that time, but it was Greek. So the Teutonic people of northwestern Europe began to favor the Greeks as the birth child of civilization. But they didn't forget the first civilizations of the world developed in the Indus Valley, Crete, and the Nile Valley of Egypt. The Nile Valley, the black civilization of the Nile Valley were the first major civilization that began to develop in the Middle East and in that area. Now what happened was, the second factor, besides the rise of Christianity, that began to get involved with the slave stuff, is the rise of the concept of progress. The European people, as they began to come out of the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, began to see themselves as a different group of people from the rest of the human race. The new paradigm of progress that emerged in Europe during this period of colonization viewed Egypt and the Jewish people as inferior people. And this began to develop in the universities of northwestern Europe. And there were three guys who began to develop theories about people. Now at that time, the thinking that people belonged to land masses. You were recognized by land mass who you were, not your color. It was where you came from, your land mass. But now, as the rise of progress began to come, the colonizers began to see themselves as the great people to come and to take over the world. And they saw Egypt and the Semitic groups of the Near East as being people who were lacking in progress. Lacking in progress. The third and most damaging factor was the rise of racism. Now, how did this come about? There were three guys who were the fathers of racism, and that's why I started in Germany, because they were at the major university there. And one of these guys was by the name of Jez Blumenbach, who was a professor of natural history in the University of Göttingen. Am I saying it right, sister? University of Göttingen?
I'm not sure.
Anyway, these professors began to write a new kind of worldview about man. And one of the racial species hierarchy worldviews that they developed is that the people who lived in the northern climate were superior. People who had lighter skin were superior. This began to penetrate the literature of your educational system. And when that stuff gets embedded in your thinking and your system, it's hard to get out because it developed the conscience of your mind. These guys, Blumenbach, Comte Gobineau, and Carl Mueller began to write a different history. Began to write a different paradigm about people on this earth. And they began to say that the people who live in the northern climates of the world are superior and more intelligent. And that stuff got into the universities. It penetrated the church. It penetrated the legal system. It penetrated politics. And it got embedded in the societies of Europe that became a part of the colonizers of the new world. That's how we got racism. That's how we got racism. And when racism get involved into your mind process, into your educational process, into your politics, into your religion, it's hard to get out. So we just barely begin to climb out of this guy. But anyway, that's what happened. This is what happened. So the African people then, because slavery was already there, the European people came involved and made people slaves. But in their system, what happened, slavery in Africa did not have the stigma of race. When it became part of the European concept of mind and consciousness, it became a part of the stigma that you are inferior because of you are black or you are this or that. That's what happened. It became embedded into the culture. So when the European people came to America, that concept was here. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the people of West Africa. Now, the people of West Africa, there are many groups there. They are not all the same groups. There are many groups there. There are 4 major language groups in West Africa. And these are the Niger-Kordofanian group of languages, which constitute most of this area here. They speak a different language group. Now, there are many, many dialects, but that's the main language, the Niger-Kordofanian language group. The second language group is called the Kosan language group. This language group constitutes most of the people here in Namibia, the South African, and the Mandela group, the Mandela people. They speak that language group. And there's another language group called the Afro-Asiatic language group. The Semitic, the Aramic, which Jesus spoke, part of that language group. See, the Jews' language group is not a European language group. Hebrew is not a European language. It's an Afro-Asiatic language group. The people around the Nile, people in the Middle East, the Arabs, that's that language group called Semitic people. Okay? Then there's the last group is called the Nilo-Saharan language group. And this is the language group that exists mostly kind of over in this area here. But the Afro-Asiatic would be the people in Ethiopia, Cushitic, they speak that language. The people along the bridge here, the Semitic, speak that language. They are Semitic, Afro-Asiatic language groups. So basically, the language group of the people coming out of this region in West Africa were most of the Niger-Kordofanian group. And there are many dialects. Now, there are many people there. And if you look at some of the groups there, and if you look at some of the countries there, for example, if you look at Angola, which is the last island there, it was mainly a Portuguese colony, and later on became French, you looked at the occupation also of the people. Now, most of the people who came here who were African, West Africa, they were iron makers, mainly agriculturists, mainly hunters, bronze workers, textile, clothing. You go to Africa, you see beautiful clothes, they make their clothes. You'll see cattle raising, and you see hunting and fishing. Those were their primary occupations, but the primary occupation was agriculture. That's why the people appeal so much to European people, because they were looking for people to work on these large plantations. So they began to move them into the Americas. Now I said when I first found where my people came from, as I traced them, we traced them to Virginia, and that's where the McDades came into, and later on to Alabama and Georgia. So when this state opened in 1812, after Andrew Jackson defeated the British at New Orleans, this became a slave state in 1812. So as I began to trace the history of my people, I began to look and see when they came here. They began to come into this area, according to my figuring, somewhere around the 1840s and 1850s. Like Minden, 1835? That's when this time was up. 1836, Vita, and those guys, around that time. That's when they began to migrate. Whites from Middle and East Tennessee came into this area first as migrants, and they brought their slaves with them because I found out one of my slaves, Reverend John Warren John Warren, according to his history, he came from Missouri. But I looked into the records and I saw that his family came from Kentucky. Father by the name of Getty, John Warren. John Warren came into this area as a slave. He was born in 1841. He came and he married a lady out of Houma. She was a Harris. Now she was part Indian. Now a lot of blacks who came here also were part European people. They were part European people. A lot of mulattoes. Because one of the things that happened on these plantations is the plantation was a system within itself. It was a law within itself. The master had control over everything. The women, everybody else. So on his plantation, he had these little houses in the field. Well, he made it with the African women. When you look at African people, 80% of them have European genetics. You trace it back, you find European genetics. That's a lot of them. Especially in the South. And the area that forbade intermarriage. Strong farming in that group. You see? You made rules for the man, but not for the woman. Woman couldn't do nothing about it. She saw all these light-skinned kids on her plantation. She knew where they would come, either from the master or from the master's son. So that kind of thing developed in the South. So they had so much intermixture. There was probably more intermixing during slavery time and Reconstruction time, any time in the period of the United States history. But it was forbidden. Anyway, as I began to trace them, as we looked at the plantation along the Red River, the McDade people, they had large holdings there. After they were part of the Civil War, and after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and the slaves were given freedom of citizenship by the 14th Amendment, and the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, they never could exercise that. Because Reconstruction, remember, lasted a very small time. From 1865 to 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes, he made a compromise with the Democrats and the Republicans. He compromised. His compromise was that: get the army out. Put the master back in control. Put the master back in control. So when the master got back into control, he set up iron laws. White terrorist groups began to emerge. The Ku Klux Klan, the White Committee, they began to emerge to frighten people from voting, to exercise their citizenship. They couldn't. Something happened here in West Parish. What happened in West Parish? Now, the Republicans was in control of West Parish. Now, the Republicans wanted power because during Reconstruction, a lot of blacks got the right to vote. And they were putting people in Congress. They were putting people. One of your governors here, Pitchback, P.S. Pitchback, was the governor for a little while. And you had blacks ruling until the Klans and these people stopped it. And what happened was, after Reconstruction, after 1877, a system developed, another system of slavery called indentured slavery, which is sharecropping. Now, you know what sharecropping is. My daddy was one. I was born in the sharecropping system. Sharecropping, where the control of men, plantation owner had to have somebody to harvest these fields. So they asked the blacks to stay on this plantation. Stay on here, and we'll give you a little bit. But what it was they kept on the land. What the owner would do, he would give you a few seeds. He would give you the equipment, but you had to labor for nothing. Now, he might have given you 25 cents a week, or maybe $1.50 a month, but you always in debt. Even poor whites. Even poor whites who didn't own land were in debt to the large landowners, because the large landowners controlled everything. So this indigenous slave system of sharecropping started. And this is what most of us at my age grew up in. And I see my friend John Gill, who's my cousin, just found out. John and I don't know why he just found out. We had the same great-great-grandfather. James Smith, same great-great-grandparent, right, James? That's right. See, same. So all of us are related to each other here in the Minden area. All of us are related. So basically, that's how it started out. Sharecropping. Sharecropping. And the sharecropping, you could never get out of debt because the man kept the book. care how much you owe at the end of the season, if you didn't make the money, you still owe it. So you stayed tied to the land. Tied to the land. 1896, Blessed versus First. What did that do? It said, hey, you know, what did it say? Separate but equal.
Yeah.
You're separate but you're equal. That philosophy stayed there a long time until the 1954 decisions. Now, the black church. Now, I could talk about the black church. It's that whole theme on the black church. Now, when the black church was first formed, I found the first church that I found here, down, I think, in Taylor, was in Bienville there. A church was set up in 1858. And that church was started by black and white. Because oftentimes, the whites, and the Mill family is a good classic example, isn't it? Anybody know the Mill family? The Mill family started in Mount Comfort, where all of my folks used to belong. Mount Comfort. The Mill family gave them 5 acres of land. They started a church. So whites, first of all, the blacks went to the churches, but in those days, in slavery, you had to sit somewhere in the back, somewhere, place, and you had to raise your hand. That's why in black church you go today, you see people raise their hand. That's how it started. That's how it started. Permission to get out, you walk out. See that? Yeah. But anyway, a lot of whites, some whites in this area, gave land to blacks. Gave land to blacks to set up their churches. St. Rest is a classic example of First Baptist Church over here, where the blacks first worship before the start of your church in 1866. That's how it started. Blacks began to set up, and when blacks began to set up their own churches, it created a different kind of climate. Because they no longer, they could discuss whatever they wanted to discuss in the church, but during those days in slavery, you couldn't assemble. You couldn't assemble as a group. But in the churches, blacks had the freedom to do what? Assemble and talk whatever they want to talk. Talk whatever they want to talk. And that was the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. Because it started with the religious leaders. Martin Luther King came out of the womb of that church. Womb of the church. And that's why it was overthrown. First of all, white man made them Christians. They bought into it, and they also freed themselves from it. With church is powerful weapon. See, the Spirit of God is the most powerful thing in the world. You can't enslave nobody. You might enslave their body, but the Spirit, you can't enslave the Spirit. You can't enslave the Spirit of anybody. That's why people revolt and get their freedom. The Russian, you can't enslave a man's spirit. That's God planted in you. You can't do it. So the blacks learned to use the Christian church to get that freedom. And see, right now you got a black president. And no one ever mentioned you could have a black president. A black president. Because the consciousness of people have changed. And they're changing. And this museum can be a great impediment toward freedom. That's why I like for black people in here, put everything you can in there. Put your history there. Because one of the things we do, we don't keep our history. If you don't keep your history, you forget your past. Support the museum. We need things in that museum. I can't do it all, Jane can't do it all. It's a lot of work. You've got to support your museum so your history can be there. Now your history is a thing that should tell you what your vision and your future should be. Without a future and a vision, you lose your history. That's what's happening to so many of our kids nowadays. They're lost. In those days, in the slavery days, they broke up families. Now, that's another subject matter, because my father's family got broken up, and they came back together after slavery. The family is the strongest thing we got here. And if we don't protect that family and bring these families together, your society won't go down the hill. That's what's going to happen to it. It's going to crumble. It's going to go, and that's what's happening to us now. White and black families. It's going down the hill. We got to, so that museum can be a piece to teach your young people in these schools what they got to do to stay free. Because if you're not free, nobody's free. You can't take nobody's freedom away. You can't take people's freedom away from them. Freedom is a divine order of God. That's my belief. It's a divine law of God. You can't hold anybody in bondage. You hold your own self in bondage when you hold somebody in bondage. You go in bondage yourself. Whatever you do to your brother, you do to yourself. You do to yourself. That's why we got to believe in freedom of all people, and we got to work toward the freedom of all people in this country. And support democracy, support letting people empower themselves. You can't give anybody anything either. People got to take it. That's my grandmother told me early in my history. She said, boy, you got, she said, Mom, the two-room school, I said, boy, you got to be 2 steps ahead of the game. 2 steps. He said, you can't take no half steps. Now, my wife and I sent 4 of our kids to college. One to Downtown University, University of Nebraska, Howard University, and community college. All those kids are doing well. Now, I raised 4 more. They ain't doing too well. Because they haven't developed that mindset. You have to have a mindset. My grandmother put a mindset, a lot of us put a mindset, boy, you go to that 2-room school, you get what you can. And you make something out of yourself. You don't sit around and make excuses that you can't blame anybody else for your failure. That's right. Can't blame you. No way. You're accountable for your own self. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm so proud of this museum and I'm proud to work for it. Thank you so much. Now, my wife, if anybody want to buy this book, I don't want to have a book signing of it. They're going to be sending me more books. I just got this copy today to approve it. My wife got a sheet. You can put your name down. It's over there. Oh, the sheet over there, if you go out and want to buy a book, this book is for sale. You can get it probably for $14. There's a hardback and there's also a softback. And I will make myself available in the museum to sign the book. There's some people out there that book sign. So please feel free to put your name on that sheet back there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you, sir.
If y'all don't get your tickets out, we're going to draw.
Relics left over from this tornado we had in 1933, something that floated there, and part of it was left. What else was it?
Well, it didn't anything to do with early black business. Anybody has a picture of the Posey feed in it? Or
any old pictures of Minden that we're getting a good collection. Well, we're getting a good collection of the Pike section of town, but really, the other side, we don't have near as much as we would like to have. We like old family pictures, especially if you can identify who the people are. That not just old pictures of people. I got a bunch of old pictures too. I don't know my side of who they are. Old Webster yearbooks or school pictures, church school pictures.
Considered a fighting side of Lincoln. We have a lot of them in this town. Shown on and that's right there. So what we need is we'd like to have these feel it's important to the black community in this community as a whole. We need
in other words, bring it to us, offer it to us, and we'll be relatively honest. Say we really don't want that, but we want the world
Yeah. But I discovered something just this week on eBay. We've been struggling on trying to find pictures of the black community, trying to find people's black photographs. I've got members of the black community here. Someone in Gardenia, California has opened up a family album. And I purchased on eBay a picture of a WAC from World War II. And there's also a picture of the 2 black Boy Scouts from the 1940s. And on the back of the photographs is stamped Mitchell Studio, Minden, Louisiana.
Yeah.
So if anyone knows if anything happened to the pictures from there, that it could be someplace. If it is, y'all are lucky because one of our studios here, when the man died, the pictures were thrown in the trash. So I hope they may have survived. I was not aware of that name until this week. So.
Okay, Lou is holding the framed Black History official print, and that is a $5 raffle that we're doing right now. If anybody would like to purchase one that did not get one earlier, raise your hand if you want one. We're going to draw for that here in just a second. Anybody else? Anybody else back here? Okay, this is your last chance to get in on the raffle. And Corlew is about to draw, okay. Corlew, you'll go ahead and draw that name for the door, the basket.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll do that. Okay.
Good job, you taught him well.
Okay, this is your last chance, everybody. Okay, Corlew. Can you? Who? Carlton Crow. Carlton, you won the door, you won the basket. You won the basket up front. That's stuff in it. Okay, we're fixing to draw, get your numbers out. We're trying to get Carlton to actually be one of our museum events. We know he would draw a big crowd. Okay, I'm going to read the last 3. Ticket number 8, 9,